Alright folks, hope all of you are doing great. Lately I've been looking towards the future of the franchise and the prospect of society returning in the Walking Dead universe. And one topic I've only briefly touched upon since the airing of Daryl Dixon Season 2 is the idea of Great Britain surviving the apocalypse. Now, if you're not caught up on the spin-offs, this may sound crazy, but yes, we are presented with evidence the government and military within Great Britain were able to secure the island before society fully collapsed, at least for the first couple years after the outbreak, which is a revelation that would change everything we've known about this universe. So today, I'm going to look at the evidence presented as to why this may or may not still be the case in the modern day, what could have led to their survival in the first place, and what this may mean for the series going forward. But with that, if you end up enjoying this video, I'd greatly appreciate it if you hit that like button, and drop a sub to see more content like this. Now, where does this concept even come from? Well, the Season 2 finale of Daryl Dixon introduced us to Scottish guides Fiona and Angus, tasked to lead our survivors through the European Channel in order to catch a boat in England back to America, as they claim the British Army were quick to lock down the borders when everything went sideways, and the island was quote-unquote good when they left, which we later find quite a bit of evidence backing this initial claim up. The key word here is island, not islands. So between that and evidence from the wrecked boat left behind by the Irish family who were out at sea for 19 months in episode 1, things over in Ireland were just as bad as anywhere else, presumably including Northern Ireland if they felt the need to flee on boat. So I'm gonna proceed under the impression Great Britain was what they were specifically referring to that survived, consisting of England, Wales, and Scotland, some of which containing their own governments and ways of functioning, but I will speak as if each worked in tandem throughout this calamity when considering Great Britain as a whole. It's unclear when the last time Fiona and Angus returned back home, but at the minimum, we know they spent the first couple years following the outbreak in Edinburgh, Scotland, where they then decided to travel to Paris as Fiona believed it was the perfect place to get married. But we don't know if they've returned home since. So if the military took over in securing the borders, we can assume most of the remaining UK survived under martial law for, at the minimum, the first 2 years. Which brings into question how they were allowed to pass through in the first place. Perhaps some soldiers were easier to bribe with gifts, as we see with Fiona approaching with wine. Or maybe travel for citizens was far less restricted than you would think. Regardless, it's kind of strange the soldiers were given orders to execute innocent French families trying to pass through, but allowed their own citizens to come and go at will. You would think they'd have a strict no traveling policy if they were so focused on security. Let me know if you guys have an explanation for this in the comments down below. But after approaching the first checkpoint intended to allow their citizens to return home while keeping the French out 12 to 13 years post-outbreak, the checkpoints have long fallen due to the soldiers going insane from the toxic fumes of bat guano within the tunnel and killing each other without mercy. This alone doesn't necessarily mean Great Britain has fallen in the years since, but the Daryl Dixon Season 3 trailer paints a very different picture as we very clearly see Daryl and Carol walking through an overgrown London, judging by that red double-decker bus in the background. We don't see any active walkers in the England portion of the brief trailer, but we do see a body left over in the background. In the same scene, we see a very happy looking man casually walking down the street, seemingly unthreatened by Carol and Daryl's presence. I think when a lot of people hear England survived, they imagine it resembling how it would in the old world, kind of like the Commonwealth or Civic Republic. But looking at this teaser, I honestly think it just means law and order mostly stayed intact as key organizations never fell, but their way of life still changed drastically as a result of the immense loss suffered during the initial outbreak. When stating the island was quote-unquote good, I believe Fiona was referring to the dead being largely cleared out. Not that they didn't experience the outbreak at all, as securing the borders wouldn't stop the virus from spreading. It would just contain how many possible hosts could be within. If this were the case, it could make sense some big cities were left largely abandoned if their population took a toll, with most of the surviving population rebuilding their lives out in the country or by the coast. There are honestly tons of theories you could come up with as to why all word-of-mouth accounts point to Great Britain still being alive, while London contradicts this by looking overgrown and mostly abandoned. However, it's just as plausible the state we find everything in is simply a result of the military eventually failing or falling in strength and numbers. Although Lo Sang in Season 1 states he knows someone who is able to take Daryl on a boat from France to England, and then from England to Newfoundland, which appears to have been the truth, as we do in fact see a boat ready to transport him at the end of Season 1. And their reasoning for going to England at the end of Season 2 is once again to catch a boat, so by all means, there is still some semblance of society left over within Great Britain if it's a modern-day hub for sea travel. Whether that's a society still working as one, or each country acting independently is yet to be determined. Now, in Season 3 of Fear, Victor Strand briefly comes into contact with a Russian cosmonaut aboard the ISS who states he watched the lights go out across the world all on the same night, which tells us as far as 2 months into the outbreak, the world still appeared dead, which obviously would have included Great Britain, so what gives? Is this a continuity error? Well, actually, I think there's a pretty reasonable and interesting explanation for this. If the UK government was quick to secure their borders, including the Channel, in order to keep refugees out, I think it would make sense for them to shut off the power and communications across the island during the first few months. If not, permanently, in order to prevent passerbys or refugees from adding to their population, leaving those in the surrounding countries to believe England was just as chaotic as any other. Dr. Jenner mentions in Season 1 of the main show the French were the last to hold out, which I think he believed at the time was true, but in reality, it seems like the correct statement would have been the French were the last to stay in contact, as I don't think it's a stretch to believe they chose to go silent and cut off the rest of the dying world's governments while they cleaned up their own mess. We see a somewhat similar situation happen in Mexico, as the government was quick to set up their military at the American border to prevent refugees from entering. However, throughout our time there, we see a lack of soldiers in the streets combating the dead. So despite society looking much more alive and active in Mexico compared to America, which saw its government bomb their cities in Operation Cobalt, the dead still plagued their country. So why was Great Britain any different than any other part of the planet we've seen? Well, with all the evidence gathered, along with my personal theories, I think a lot of it came down to being an island nation surrounded by the sea. If they were quick to secure their borders, they wouldn't have had any additional refugees adding to their population, especially if they shut off their lights and communications in order to appear dead to outsiders, as the remaining army traveled from city to city exterminating the turned while evacuating civilians to the countryside and coast, leaving their cities largely abandoned, but the remaining population in a much better position than the rest of the world as key organizations stayed intact. So with all that, could the British military/government still be functioning in the modern day somewhere despite the evidence against it shown so far? Well, it is entirely possible. Although, if people can sail there to transfer ships, and the checkpoints haven't been remanned, it seems like this isolationist way of functioning has either dissipated, or Great Britain has largely fallen into anarchy in the years since, with few remaining colonies attempting to hold on and reach out to the external world. Regardless of their current status, I think Great Britain's survival has much larger implications on the rest of the planet. If an island of this size could survive the outbreak given they had a plan for crisis, what about other island nations such as Japan or Taiwan? Hell, even Hawaii could look completely different than the mainland. For the longest time, we were led to believe there was nothing anywhere. But then we began to discover small towns and colonies across the wasteland, which eventually evolved into entire cities that braved the apocalypse. And now it's quite possible entire nations could be functioning on a much larger scale than even that of the Civic Republic. I've proposed this idea before, but I think a really cool way for the Daryl Dixon spin-off to connect to everything else would be for both Carol and Daryl to become liaisons for European countries coming back into contact with the US and its various growing colonies. A sort of re-globalization, if you will. Everything in this universe keeps growing in scale, so why not bring in these grand ideas? Even if Great Britain is largely plagued with anarchy now, just the fact they had things locked down for at least 2 years is insane. That means, as Rick and company were fighting for a new life during all-out war, those on the island of Great Britain were long adjusted to the new world. Whether they were thriving during this time like the Civic Republic or Commonwealth is still in question. I personally think this concept is extremely cool and would love to see the island largely remain peaceful. But if the army or government is still in control, perhaps in spite of now allowing foreigners to travel to their countries while opening themselves up to the larger world, remnants of their strict way of operating still linger, as gaining citizenship could be extremely difficult, if not impossible. There are so many cool ideas you could do with this concept, but rumor has it we'll only be spending an episode or two within England during Daryl Dixon's Season 3, so fingers crossed we get some crazy lore revelations during that time. But what do you guys think? Do you believe Great Britain has largely remained intact to this day, or do you think anarchy has taken over since? Do you think this lore revelation will have major implications on the future of the franchise, or do you think it'll largely be forgotten or glossed over? I want to hear your thoughts in the comments down below. But that's gonna do it for me today, folks. As always, thank you so much for watching.